Feel the neon pulse of a world where every flickering light represents a choice, a chance, or a secret. We capture the high-stakes drama of the streets through a cinematic lens of glowing colors and deep shadows. Subscribe today and keep your finger on the pulse of the night.
The night I told my parents I was marrying a man who restored old furniture for a living. My mother looked at his 7-year-old son standing in the doorway of their dining room and said, "Not to me, not to my father, but to the room itself. We are not absorbing someone else's castoffs, Nola." The boy's name was Otto. He had been holding a small wooden box he'd painted himself. Blue lid, yellow sides, a green stripe that had wobbled a little at the left corner. He'd brought it because his father had taught him you always brought something when you came to someone's house for dinner. Inside the box were 3 small carved figures he'd made himself. One for his dad, one for himself, one he hadn't named yet. He heard every word. Children always do, even when adults have fully convinced themselves otherwise. He didn't cry. He set the box very carefully on the little table by the front door, the way you set something down when you've decided it doesn't belong in a room. I should have walked out then. It took me 2 more hours and a drive home in Reese's truck with Otto asleep against my shoulder to understand that the dinner had already ended the moment my mother opened her mouth. I stayed because I kept waiting for someone to correct her. My father sat at the head of the table with his hands flat and said nothing. My brother Cormac refilled his own wine glass. To understand why my mother could look at a 7-year-old and dismiss him like a line item, you have to understand the house I grew up in. We were comfortable. That was the first thing she wanted anyone to know, and the second, and the third. We had the right neighborhood, the right cars, the right club membership. Love in that house operated on a point system, and she held the calculator. My brother Cormac was 3 years older and perpetually in the black. The right ambition, the right handshake, the exact right way of agreeing with my parents in the tone they preferred. He was the one in the photographs. Yeah. I was the one taking them. My father, Randall, was a gentle man who had developed a habit of leaving without going anywhere. He stayed in the chair, hands on the table, but some essential part of him slipped out of the room whenever the temperature rose. I want to be fair to him now. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had chosen comfort over courage so many times that the choice had stopped being visible to him. I worked in the title insurance office 3 blocks from the county courthouse. My job was verifying property records, tracing ownership chains, confirming what people had actually signed versus what they later claimed to have agreed to. I was good at it because I had grown up in a house where the official story often didn't match the paperwork, and I had learned very young to trust the version written in ink. I met Reese on a Wednesday morning in October. He came in to pull historical records on a Victorian commercial building he was considering for a major restoration job. A hotel in the old district, 60 rooms, all period-accurate furniture. He had a folder of photographs and a yellow legal pad where he'd been sketching joint configurations in pencil. When I asked what he did for work, he said, "I fix broken things. Furniture. Mostly. Old pieces people gave up on." Otto was with him because school had a half day. He sat in our waiting area with a small notebook and drew the building from Reese's photographs, every window in its correct position. When I brought his father the records, Otto held up the notebook without being asked. He had not missed a single detail. "He counts things," Rice said, not apologetically, just as information. I fell for the father first, the way you fall for something that seems both entirely ordinary and quietly extraordinary at the same time. Reese was not performing ease, he simply was. He had debts he'd tell you about if you asked. He had a temper he kept on a short leash and had apologized for once clearly before I ever needed to bring it up. He'd tried a marriage that hadn't held, and he talked about Otto's mother without bitterness. She'd wanted different things. She wasn't wrong about what she wanted. She just wasn't there. He said it like a fact, not a wound. What I fell for in Otto took longer and mattered more. He had a system for deciding whether to trust someone, and the system did not involve questions. He watched. He tracked whether I remembered things from one visit to the next. He monitored whether I showed up when I said I would, and whether I looked at him, first or last, when I walked into a room. I stopped making promises he'd have to track and just kept appearing. Around month 4, I noticed he'd stopped going to the window when I arrived. By the time Reese asked me to marry him, I had a drawer at his house. The proposal happened at his workshop on a Thursday evening, sawdust on both our hands, Otto already asleep upstairs, a ring set into a small piece of walnut he'd turned himself. I said yes before he finished the sentence. I knew better than to bring them to my parents' house. Some part of me already knew. But I waited months and convinced myself that if my parents just sat across from Reese, just spent one dinner with Otto, the warmth would win. It did not. After my mother said what she said about castoffs, my brother Cormac leaned back in his chair and watched me with the expression of someone who already knows the ending of a story and is only watching to see how long it takes. A cousin told me later that Cormac had written something on a cocktail napkin that night, a note to himself that said simply, "This won't last." He'd kept the napkin. I didn't know that yet. Remember that he kept it. In the kitchen afterward, my mother gave me the choice in her gentlest voice. "Your father's health, Nola. He needs stability right now. He needs the family together. You'd really do this to him now?" I didn't understand then that this sentence was a tool she had already decided to use. I only understood it as a warning I was choosing to walk past. We married the following June, in the backyard of Reese's business partner Vince's house, which backed to a small creek. Vince had known Reese since they were both 22, had helped build the business from a rented garage and one sanding belt. He put up string lights and folding chairs, and someone's aunt made a sheet cake that was slightly lopsided and absolutely right. There were maybe 20 people. Otto threw flower petals with the seriousness of someone disarming something, then immediately ran to the creek to look for frogs without asking permission, which felt like exactly the correct way to begin. The morning of the wedding, Reese said something I have thought about every year since. "If your family ever decides to come around, we open the door. I'm not going to be the wall between you and them." He meant it. For 7 years, he kept that door unlocked, even when I would have nailed it shut. I mailed my parents a wedding photograph. It came back in its own envelope, unopened, my name crossed out on the front in my mother's handwriting. No note. By Friday that same week, my aunt was calling to ask how I could do this to my father in his condition. A cousin sent a message about keeping my dad in her prayers. My mother had already built the story and distributed it. I had abandoned a sick man for someone beneath me and dragged an innocent child into my selfishness. I believed it. That part still costs me something to say out loud. With no way to reach my father directly, no way to verify anything, the guilt did exactly what it had been constructed to do. Why would a mother fabricate a sick husband? It was too monstrous to be a strategy, so I carried it like it was real. Otto carried something of his own. About 3 weeks after the wedding, he came and found me in the kitchen and said, in his straightforward way, "She called me a castoff." I looked it up. It means something nobody wanted. He wasn't crying. He was reporting a finding the way he always did. I didn't give him a speech. He was 7, and speeches are for the person giving them, not the person receiving them. I said, "She said that because of who she is, not because of who you are. You are the reason I stayed." Then I did the thing that actually meant something. The next morning, I added his name to my emergency contact on file at the pediatric clinic. I wrote my number on the inside cover of his school planner, "Call Nola first." He saw it at breakfast and didn't say anything. He carried the planner out the door, like it weighed more than usual. in a way that had nothing to do with the weight. That night, he brought out the wooden box. He had added a new carved figure, small, patient-looking, with what I can only describe as generous hair, curly in a way mine technically is not. He set it next to the original 3, without ceremony. "Now there's 4, he said. "That's enough for a family." I put the box on the kitchen windowsill. I had no idea it would become the most important object in my life. The years that followed were lean in the specific grinding way that doesn't produce good stories unless you lived through them. 2 incomes stretched across 3 lives. Reese left before dawn and came home smelling like varnish and old wood. I kept the contracts, chased the invoices, logged every document the business touched, because I am constitutionally unable to let a paper go unsigned in the wrong place. He built things. I made sure we could keep building them. Neither of us could have done it from one end alone, and I want to say that plainly, because later people would try to tell the story as though I had quietly funded a great man. I didn't. We carried the same house from opposite sides. There was a night in the first winter that told me who we were going to be. Otto spiked a fever that climbed fast, the scary kind, and Reese was 4 hours out on a job he couldn't leave without losing a deposit that was keeping our heat on. My own office had a filing deadline I'd already pushed twice. I sat on the bathroom floor with a cold cloth until the fever broke near 3 in the morning, and I let the deadline go. When it broke, Otto said, half asleep, "You didn't leave." Not a question, a data point. He'd been running the same experiment since the day we met, and that night the results came in. The business turned a corner because Reese refused to cut corners. He had spent years in commercial restoration, and by 2021, he had developed a reputation specific enough to become its own specialty: historic hospitality properties. Hotels, restaurants, private clubs that needed period-accurate furniture at scale without sacrificing craft. There was almost no one doing it the way he did. Vince ran operations while Reese handled design and sourcing, and I handled every document with a timestamp and a permission log because that is the only way I know how to keep something honest. Cormac had been watching. I only understood that later. The first text from my brother arrived after 3 years of silence, warm and surprise-sounding, full of childhood references that were accurate enough to sting. 3 messages in, he asked casually how the business was structured. He had a contact, he said, who might be interested. 4 messages after that, he asked me to co-sign a line of credit for what he called a temporary situation. He framed it as a favor between people who had simply drifted. I said no, gently, and explained my reasoning. He went quiet for 2 years. I kept the texts. Everything goes in the folder. The folder was a brown legal accordion file in the locked drawer of my desk. Inside, in order, the returned wedding photo. 12 birthday cards Otto had made and mailed to my parents over 7 years, every one of them sent back unopened, Otto's name in his own handwriting on the back of each envelope. A forwarded message from a cousin, sent by accident, that contained my mother's exact language about my father's health and my abandonment of him, and a dated journal entry from the night my aunt, not realizing what she was saying, mentioned that my father had just driven himself 6 hours each way to Lake Morse for a fishing week with his friends. A man too fragile for a phone call from his daughter. 6 hours each way, alone, with a fishing pole and a full tank of gas. I wrote the date down and told myself I'd misunderstood, because the alternative meant the leash had been a lie from the beginning, and I wasn't ready yet to follow that where it led. Naughton, Austin. Otto turned 14 the year the business reached the number that changed everything, which I am not going to dress up. A regional hospitality group made an acquisition offer that put the company's total valuation at just under $11 million. We didn't take the full acquisition. We took a partial investment instead, kept our controlling interest, and gained operating capital. On paper, our household's share of that valuation was somewhere around $4 million. On paper. In the actual bank account, a mortgage, 2 truck payments, and Otto's orthodontia. Cormac found out through a mutual cousin within 10 days. My mother called 5 days after that. Her voice came through warm and unhurried, like a door opening into a room I hadn't been in for 7 years and finding it exactly the same temperature as when I'd left. "Nola, sweetheart," she said, "it has been far too long." Not, "I was wrong," not, "I'm sorry," just, far too long, as though distance were weather, something that had simply settled between us without anyone's hand in it. She wanted to come by, to see where we'd landed. Cormac texted within the hour, childhood memories, old summers, warmth arriving in careful layers. Woven through all of it in every third message, "Have you thought about what family means now, what family is owed?" If someone has ever reappeared in your life the exact week your circumstances changed. Not the week you were struggling, not the week you needed them, but the week the news about you changed. You already know what that phone call tastes like. You can describe it to the temperature. Reese and I talked it through at the kitchen table that night. Same table where the numbers had once looked impossible. We decided to open the door one time, listen, say nothing we hadn't pre-agreed on. We went over our limits in advance, the way you go over an evacuation route. Clearly, before the emergency. And without discussion, we agreed on one thing. Otto would not be home. He went to our neighbor, Marta's, for the afternoon, a retired school teacher 2 houses down, who had decided, without anyone's permission, to become our family's unofficial grandmother about 2 years in and had never needed to announce it. Before they arrived, I took the accordion folder out of the locked drawer and set it on the kitchen counter, within reach. They came on a Saturday, my mother in her good coat, Cormac half a step behind her, holding a folder of his own, professional-looking, thick, corners sharp. I noticed the folder before anything else because folders like that don't get put together overnight. They get built over months, revised, refined, carried around in a bag waiting for the right moment. We sat in the living room. My mother looked around at our house and did the math on it, furniture, square footage, what it suggested. Then she folded her hands and said, in her most reasonable voice, "We think it's time to heal this family. But healing has to be honest. It has to be fair about what everyone has given." Cormac slid the folder across the coffee table. Inside, a typewritten list. My mother read it aloud like she was presenting something self-evident. $1.2 million, which represented the investment in raising me. The education, the opportunities, the childhood that had made me who I was. A position for Cormac within the company's administrative structure, given his connections in the industry, which she described at some length. A monthly contribution toward my father's ongoing care and medical needs. And, at the bottom of the page, one final item, a written statement to be shared at the next family gathering and signed by me, confirming that I had come home, that the breach was healed, that I had returned to the people who raised me. Reese read the whole document at his own pace, which is the pace of a man who is not in a hurry because he already has what he needs. He went down the page once, came back up to one specific line, and then, just barely, at the corner of his mouth, he smiled. It wasn't triumph. I want to be precise about this because he is not that kind of man. It was the expression of someone who has just watched a person hand them the exact thing they had no way of getting on their own. "Thank you," he said quietly. He set the page down. "You just documented everything." My mother's face stopped moving. She reached for the folder. Reese's hand was already resting on the edge of it. 7 years, he said, still quiet. Nola's father has been too sick to be disturbed. That's what we were told. Too fragile for contact. He tapped the line about monthly care contributions, but you're billing us for his ongoing medical needs. Which is interesting because 2 summers ago, someone mentioned he'd driven himself up to Lake Morse for a fishing week, 6 hours each way. He looked at my mother, by himself, for a man who can't take a phone call from his daughter. I opened the accordion folder. I want to tell you I had rehearsed this, I hadn't. I only knew the order things had to come out in, because I had been keeping them in that order for 7 years. First, the texts from Cormac, the warm approach 3 years ago, the childhood memories, and then 4 messages in, the cosign request, then the silence, then this year's version, same opening, same pivot. I laid them side by side on the coffee table and didn't say anything, because anyone who has ever had a script run on them twice, in the same voice by the same person, can read a side-by-side comparison in about 4 seconds. You practiced on me, I said to Cormac, 3 years ago. Same opening, same memories, same turn toward what you needed. I said no, and you disappeared for 2 years. I looked at my mother, and you have spent 7 years telling everyone I abandoned a sick man. But you just handed me a bill for his ongoing care. You cannot hold both versions. A man who was left behind and a man who needs monthly management. Your lawyer will have to pick one story, so will mine. Cormac tried to redirect toward fairness, toward what family meant, toward how much had been sacrificed by everyone, and then he said the word that told me everything. He said, "We need this, Nola, need. Not deserve, need." The golden child said need, and I finally saw the structure underneath all of it. Not my parents protecting their standing, not my mother protecting a story, but Cormac's actual situation. A business that had gone sideways. Debs hidden behind the right clothes and the right address. My mother had been the architecture, holding his version of things together, and the architecture had used up its materials. I reached into the folder for the last item, a cocktail napkin in a small plastic sleeve, mailed to me 2 years after the wedding by a cousin who thought I deserved to know what had been said in the room the night my family met my husband and his son. Cormac's handwriting, "This won't last," the date written on the back, the same evening my mother had called Otto a castoff. "You wrote this," I said. "You kept it. Someone else thought it was worth keeping too, for a different reason." I set it on top of the stack. Cormac looked at the napkin the way people look at something they were certain no longer existed. Then the front door opened. My mother had brought my father. He had been in the car. I understood immediately, positioned as a figure to soften the room if needed. The frail presence in the background giving moral weight to the ask. But he had gotten out of the car on his own. He had walked up the front path and opened the unlocked door and come in, because Reese had never once locked it. My father looked at the documents on the table. He looked at Otto's 12 returned birthday envelopes, still sealed, arranged in a row, Otto's child handwriting on every one. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said to my mother in a voice I had never in my life heard him use, "This has to stop." She started to explain. He shook his head once, and she stopped. I had watched him fold napkins into perfect squares for 30 years. To signal that a conversation was over without having to say so. This time he just shook his head. Whatever had shifted in him, on the walk up the path, it had shifted all the way. Cormac tried one final time, pivoting to logistics, to what was reasonable, to what the numbers actually meant for a family. I let him finish completely. "You cannot bill me for raising me and ask me to announce that I came home," I said. "Those are 2 different stories about who left whom. You put both of them on the same page, in the same document, in your own handwriting. A lawyer only needs the page." My mother reached for the folder. I let her have it. She didn't need the original. Reese had photographed every page on his phone while he was still reading it. I told them 3 things, and only 3 things. No money, no position for Cormac, no statement, because the only statement I would make was the factual one, which the documents could speak to on their own. Our attorney. A woman named Gwen, who had handled the company's legal work for 3 years and understood exactly the difference between a grievance and a case, would be in contact about the terms of any future communication, and the terms would have teeth because they now had documentation to attach to them. They left. My mother, with her coat, my brother with the revised understanding of a man who had arrived expecting to collect and was leaving with a copy of his own words. My father stayed. He sat down in the chair across from me, not near my mother's empty seat, but directly across, as if he'd thought about where to sit, and put his hands flat on his knees, and said, I let her use my health as a story, because it was easier than a conversation I didn't know how to have. I knew what she was doing. I watched her return that Boysford cards and I said nothing. There is no version of that where I am not responsible for it. He paused. I'm not asking you to pretend otherwise. I had rehearsed versions of this moment for years, all of them angrier, all of them less honest about the feeling underneath, which was not rage so much as exhaustion, and underneath the exhaustion a very old grief for a father who had always been slightly more available than he'd been able to show. I can forgive you, I told him. I can give you that today. Trust is slower, and I set the pace, and you don't get to rush it toward a number you need. I looked at him steadily, but the forgiveness is yours right now, for free. He nodded like a man who had expected that answer and considered it more than he'd earned. We started small, a phone call once a week, something either of us could step back from without damage. A month later, he asked, very carefully, if it might ever be possible to meet Otto. Not soon, he said quickly. Whenever Otto wanted, if he ever did, on Otto's terms entirely. I told him that was exactly the right way to ask, and that it would be completely up to Otto. He said, of course it is. I drove home lighter than I had been in 7 years. Not happy exactly, but the particular lightness that comes from setting down something you'd stopped noticing you were carrying. Otto was on the porch when I pulled in, which meant Marta had told him I was close. He had the wooden box in his hands, turning it the way he turned things over when he was working something out. He'd repainted it at some point in the last year, still blue on the lid, but the green stripe was steadier now. Marta said, something got handled, he said. Some things got resolved, I said. He looked at the box. Then, in the flat voice he used for things that were actually enormous, he said, she called me a castoff when I was 7. I looked it up again last year. It means something worthless that got discarded. He turned the box over in his hands. But you kept every card I ever sent them. Every single one, 7 years. You kept them in a folder with a lock on it. He looked up. I was never a cast-off. I was evidence. I didn't say anything. Sometimes the right response to a 14-year-old who has just said something that precise is simply to let it land. He reached into his pocket and held up a small carved figure I hadn't seen before, rougher than the others, the work of someone still learning to carve, clearly meant to be an older man. For your dad, he said, if he earns it. He said, if the way someone says it who has thought carefully about the conditions and intends to hold to them. That's exactly right, I said, if. He placed the figure inside the box and set it on the windowsill, and we went inside. Marta was already there, because she had a key and had decided that a night like this called for her cornbread, about which she is never wrong. Reese burned the garlic, which he does every single time, despite claiming to have a new understanding of garlic. We ate at the kitchen table with Otto narrating our cooking failures like a sportscaster, calling a close game, and nobody kept a ledger, and nobody was owed anything, and it was by every measure that has ever mattered a family at a table. The box is still on the windowsill, blue lid, steadyr green stripe, 4 original figures, and 1 conditional one, waiting to be earned. Some doors you close all the way. Some you hold open an inch on your own schedule at your own pace. The difference between forgiveness and access is the hinge. And you own it. And you decide which direction it swings. And no one gets to rush you toward an answer they need before you're ready to give it. If someone handed you a list and called it healing, then you already know what I spent 7 years learning. You were never the cast-off. You were the one doing the keeping.